exciting. Definitely hardware-wise, there are many different hardware architectures that can do AI, but the GPU does seem to be a very strong player in this space. And of course, NVIDIA being dominant in that is the leader in anything AI. Their enterprise cards are absolutely amazing for training, but for us, what really stands out is there is an orders of magnitude more consumer cards across the globe that can be used more and more for AI inference, for fine tuning, and even as we're seeing week to week training as you have innovations happening in the space. So it's very much been dominated by NVIDIA, and that's really in our DNA as our artists mostly use those nodes. Outside of that, Apple is starting to move into that, but there are some challenges on accessing the GPU on Apple. So these things are dynamic. But when I look at just the trends, we've gone from very large models to those models being more and more quantized and being able to fit locally on edge devices. And we're starting to see agentic elements take part and assist this architecture. For me, really, one of the biggest innovations that I've seen most recently was Moonshot's Kimi K2 model, with 384 sub experts. And honestly, I love what that unlocks on in a decentralized context. To bring it back in terms of what a decentralized network is, today it is quite limited, but it is expanding rapidly and is the area where the most opportunity is for compute, given the abundance of idle compute in that space.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Trevor. Tim, I'd love for you to share your insight on this too. Do you see a future where average users become both consumers and suppliers of compute? Or is there a hard line between running AI locally for privacy and plugging into these broader decentralized networks?
I love this question because it really hits at the heart of whether Web3 itself is going to be useful for AI. And so first I'm going to tell you, yes, that's the TLDR. And then I'm going to kind of give you background that Scripted was founded by generative AI experts from major studios like Electronic Arts and Square Enix. So we come from a game development background. So we're very familiar with both content generation for entertainment and also like actually offloading things to users to create content, whether that's in virtual worlds like MMORPGs or in like AI-based games. So the first challenge that I've found is that in a centralized system, like let's say AWS, for instance, I can allocate as many within reason second tier NVIDIA cards as I need. For instance, I could get a bunch of A100s and I can run a bunch of neural loads for things like Stable Diffusion, for instance, the open weight flux models, which are like top class right now, Black Forest Labs all the way, or even the video models that are open source. The problem with that is when you really need to scale it and you need to move to the H100s or 200s, suddenly you run into capacity blocks. We're not a $100 million startup, we're a multi-million dollar startup, right? And there's a huge difference there in being able to quickly scale infrastructure in a centralized fashion. And believe me, I don't want to disparage the centralized method. It's absolutely critical for people to have access to that when they need it. So the great hope, of course, has been how do we decentralize that compute? And so from our side, we look at something like Render Network. And instead of an H100, like the top class crazy cards that NVIDIA offers, could we use consumer GPUs? Could we use a 4090 or 3090 or 4080? Can we use stuff that is coordinated and we're passing costs, our costs onto these users as their profit? And the answer is yes, but it depends on whether those workloads can themselves be split up. And some methods traditionally have not been splittable. For instance, video generation has generally been very difficult. We actually set out ourselves to develop a video orchestration model that could split workloads for a given video generation. Say you want 20 seconds of video, like continuous, and you wanted to shard that out. You wanted to actually split the workloads into pieces amongst various like 4090 containers. And we ended up patenting it because we had to invent that method, right? Whereas things like image generation are already accessible and you can just do it. And that's like the low-hanging fruit. So to me, I see this great value in these distributed render networks, just like render. Well, it's actually called render network. Ha. I love that name because it just tells you what it is. And in order for like this to succeed, now we have to, it's not just about bringing down costs, it's about making the payments very liquid, right? So it's about how quickly can I move $1 from a customer to $1 for compute? Because otherwise, companies like mine have to retain larger reserves on our balance sheets to like pay the upfront cost generation for the generations and then collect the money from the users. Do you see what I mean? So now the challenge is less on do the networks exist? They demonstrably do, and I'm very excited about that. And more, how do I scale and pay those networks very effectively? That's what we're interested in being a part of.
Okay, brilliant answer there, Tim. Yeah, that's some really good insight. Mike, as autonomous agents become more capable and widespread, who should bear the cost of their compute? Would it be the users, platforms, or the agents themselves via economic models?
Well, I think we're going to see business models around every possible way. But as a user, if you're not the one paying for it, it's really likely that you're the product. And realistically, your interactions are probably being packaged and sold to someone else to either advertise to you, train something to manipulate you, etc. So I would encourage most people to start thinking about what their AI risk profile is. Am I using this for a business that OpenAI can compete with? Do I have an application that an agent could build and replace that understands everything that I've been doing? So just be aware of what your risk is, right? Like if you're just using it to like, I mean, if you're just using it for something small where you don't really care if you're doing it publicly on the internet, use whatever you want. But what I would say is there is an economy that is growing around this idea of independent AI. There's people who want to not have everything in their life out there for AI to be trained on. Basically, if those models understand you, they can manipulate you and get you to do what you want. And so we're seeing this alternate economy. And what I have on my machine is I have a machine where I can run, 14 billion parameter models quite easily. And so a lot of the tool calling, a lot of the, I want all that stuff to happen locally. And then I only want to call out to Render and Venice and these different platforms when my machine isn't capable of doing it. When I need something bigger. And so I would say the default that we want is to have things be local. And when not, we want them to be private and decentralized. And we want to have the right partners in place to do that.
Perfect answer there. I completely agree with you there, Mike. Um, Edward, could we see agents managing their own compute budgets, bidding for decentralized resources, or earning credits through useful work?
Wow, that is a loaded question. And I think, Tim Cotton was alluding to this earlier in your comments there, Tim. Yeah, I think one of the things that Tim put the spotlight on and that your question, reinforces there is, how are we going to scale and pay for, decentralized network services, especially in an economy that is driven by autonomous agents. And so the mechanisms that we're seeing in, leveraging from known, places where this has been solved. So a place where this has been solved is in the world of Wall Street trading, high frequency algorithmic trading, and how to expose services amongst the actors and the players that provide those services is very well established. It's of course not decentralized. It's very Web 2, and it leverages a bunch of lawyers and contracts. So it breaks the decentralized model. So what we're trying to achieve and what we're doing and working with partners, and to answer your question directly, is in order to enable autonomous agents to purchase their own compute and then to earn value for the resources they provide or the output and the data that they create. One, we're going to need decentralized marketplaces. And we're seeing that come to life on networks like Manifest and Render, where we can match compute demand with supply And we can do that based on the type of compute. So for example, with Gember, when we need, distributed, offline GPU, render is perfect, and the cost savings on render are obvious. When we need online real-time compute, we would run that on Manifest. And again, leveraging the MFX token and power, we know what that is. So that gets to my second point, Sunny, which is we need tokenized and transparent payments. So it can be a native token like Render. It could be a stable coin. The interfaces for the agents and the applications to pay exactly for what they consume isn't totally there yet. So where protocols like MCP have now exposed the tools and solved the interoperability, we haven't totally gotten to the interoperability protocols for autonomous agent transactions. So to get literal, it would be enabling an agent to programmatically budget, bid, and settle compute costs without any human intervention. So it's a fully, to solve this, what needs to appear are programmable payment rails and the smart contracts that can run on those rails to enable that full end-to-end automation. And then we all know that economies fall apart if the interests and incentives of the participants aren't aligned. So being able to incentivize supply and also, manage cost inflation in these economies is going to be key. And so there are plenty of tools in Web3 that we can leverage for this, which includes staking and rewards. And we're already seeing that. So, as a node operator on Manifest, I can earn rewards for providing that compute, and I can get paid when, agents or humans or anyone consume that compute. So I think what we're going to see happening near term is these hybrid payment strategies are going to arise. The Web2 enterprises are trying to figure out how to get into the space. The Web3 crypto exchanges are trying to figure out how to open the gateways to fiat. And my ultimate hope is that very quickly, especially with this new legislation that's coming out, we're going to see cross-network and fiat on-ramps that are very compliant, very sustainable, and that'll expose an interface that the autonomous agents can use. And my best guess is that's going to become very real in the next 12 to 18 months. And I would love anyone to debate me or challenge that.
That's very interesting, Eric. Thank you so much for that. Paul, I recently saw a tweet where a former Meta employee said the biggest bottleneck for AI infrastructure isn't money, it's power. So even giants like Meta can't scale fast enough because transformers, cooling, and raw energy supply are all tapped out. So how does the Render network or similar decentralized compute networks navigate this constraint?
Yeah, good question. If you think about what are the costs of compute, the two big inputs are chips and the electricity to run those chips, right? And last few years we had some shortages in chips, but those have been easing greatly. It's much easier today to get a leading edge consumer card like a 5090 than it was, say, last year during Christmas or something. And so now it comes down to electricity, and as big cloud providers, hyperscalers, look at, do they want to train their latest edge model, or do they want to make compute available to their customers in their cloud? Often they're choosing themselves, and they don't have the electricity to do both. They literally cannot get their hands on the gigawatts of power that they need to do both. And so consumers are starting to see that pinch, and like the availability of some very popular chips on cloud networks at hyperscalers have been limited, like largely because of power. And the thing that distributed compute like the Render network has is we have a global footprint, right? And so, as the sun goes down in one area of the globe and people start to go to sleep, power is available. Power is available to, utilize those chips that would be unused while people are sleeping, and get those compute jobs done and do them at a much better price point because the power is cheap. If you happen to live in Texas, you're very aware of the very volatile nature of electricity costs these days. And so, sometimes it costs $1,000 a kilowatt hour when there's peak demand in the middle of a summer afternoon. Sometimes it's literally negative. The power company will literally pay you to consume electricity because wind farms, solar farms are overproducing what's being consumed on the grid. And so, the render network being decentralized is one of the only ones that can literally tap into electricity that has a negative cost, where the power company will pay you to run the chip. And so, it's a great opportunity to, be very green, use power that would otherwise go to waste, use chips that would otherwise be latent, but also, tap into the distributed network of a worldwide infrastructure like render. So, yeah, great question.
Yeah, that was a really good answer there, Paul. It's a very interesting thing, which we can go into in more depth another time. But Trevor, what do you think are the key trade-offs that teams face when choosing where to run their AI workloads in terms of availability, reliability, cost, and regulatory risk?
Uh, We, we've gone through this already on the rendering side, and I always like to give this analogy. When you look at rendering, there are essentially two diverging schools of rendering. The one is real time, really the games engines. And when you try and render something real time, today your trade-off is quality. When you view something that's been rendered real time for a game engine, it is just not quite photorealistic. And where we've really focused the render network is on the other side, on photorealistic items, and those your trade-off is time. You're giving up the real-time aspect, but in return you're getting a much higher quality output, and in many cases it's done at a lower cost because it's via this decentralized network. And when I think about AI workloads, I think in very similar terms. There are use cases where time is an absolute premium, and you'd probably be better suited towards centralized. But there are a host of other use cases where time is not the number one factor, but maybe cost is, right? Where having SOC 2 compliance security isn't really that important. It's just access to a working GPU. And what I love about listening to some of these partners is I'm really seeing these types of use cases emerge that work well on decentralized, that aren't time at an utmost premium, but are batch type jobs, or are jobs that don't need the level of security that perhaps you need on centralized. So the trade-offs to me are absolutely key in how we scale up the idle consumer compute that's available for these customers today.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that, Trevor. I'm going to let Taco take over the rest of the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, some really high points there. So for Eric, can builders realistically piece together inference across GPU marketplaces, decentralized networks, and centralized cloud? How is that working today?
Yeah, good question. Sometimes yes and sometimes no. It's important to remember that we're really early in this space, comparatively speaking. And if you look at the bulk of developers, they're really going to tend back towards the traditional solutions that have always been their stalwarts. So if you look at absolute numbers, it's important. I guess let me back up a second. It's important in Web3 to understand where we sit in an absolute number standpoint. We're still a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the overall market. So most of the time, developers are still not choosing this pathway. It's still new. It's still largely unknown. But things are getting better literally daily. So whereas right now the bulk of developers are not really going to piece together inference on a decentralized network, the growth in this has now hit the point where we can see the future if you're looking, right? So the tools are getting better every day. The cost savings are real. All the constraints mentioned on this panel already, availability of chips and and power those are real constraints, although somewhat artificial. And I can go into that more later if we want to do a follow-up question. This is still a tiny market, but it's now proven enough that for certain use cases, you can now put together solutions that actually work, right? So I think Trevor usually does a really good job of couching things in use cases, right? Having been on many panels with him. So I'll borrow that technique here. It's all about your use case right now. If your use case fits the tools that are available, you absolutely can use a fully decentralized solution to get to your end state. The number of use cases that fits are just simply, pretty low right now. But tools are getting radically better. Partnerships like all of us are in here on this panel are making things better on a daily basis. So you can see the trend line now. You can see it used to be 1/100%. Then it's 1/10%. Then it's 1%. And you're like, okay, if we can get across that threshold, which I believe we have, then you can see that it's just a matter of grinding on the tools and fitting the use cases into the tooling. So I think that's kind of a balanced answer to your question, Taco. I don't know if it's specific enough, but it just really depends on your use case. And it's important for us in Web3 to remember that we're just at the beginning of these solutions, but they're very, very promising. In 5 years, you're absolutely going to be able to do almost every use case decentralized, right? We're just not quite there yet. As Edward mentioned, one of the big problems is actually not technical, it's payment rails, right? So most companies in the world still can't hold tokens or won't hold tokens, right? They're just economically not set up to do so. So the number one thing I would say, if you want to make this a reality, I'll actually go back to Edward's comment. It's about payment rails primarily first. Then we'll figure out the rest of the stuff, right? That's technical stuff. Does that make sense?
It does to me. And I actually have some payment stuff that we're going to be getting into a little bit later. We're sort of going to shift a little bit now and sort of talk about what's next for generative AI. And will next-gen generative platforms combine edge inference and decentralized orchestration? Paul, in what scenarios does it make the most sense to push generative AI closer to the edge, whether for latency, privacy, offline functionality, or even compliance?
Yeah, in all of those cases, right? I mean, and we'll just talk about latency real quick. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things that we're working at Render Labs, and that I think will be very interesting in the next few quarters, is automatic routing of an agentic behavior to find that best trade-off point between where it's located close to the user for performance, on the right chip for generation time, at the right place, based on cost of electricity in that location and cost of generation. So there's like multiple trade-offs that are occurring there between making sure the compliance is right, and all the other things that I mentioned are part of the picture. And I think where it becomes very, very interesting is when the agents reason about that autonomously, right? It's not just a prescribed, if in this compliance region, use this data center. And so I think that's a very interesting edge case that's like now become, a great case for, a distributed network like Render, is like how we fill that better than a hyperscaler can. That's like, okay, you can run AWS East, AWS West, and that's it. And so, I think it's a very interesting area that we're actively working on at Render Labs to push the envelope on and make that available to the whole Render ecosystem and a lot of our partners here today.
Nice. Yeah, no, and I want to touch a little bit more on the privacy side with this. To Tim, I know know you have some stuff on this, but what are the biggest gaps holding back smooth coordination between edge devices and decentralized compute? Are we still missing key pieces like job schedulers, incentive models, and shared state access, or are the A2A and MCP bridging the gap of that?
Yeah. So this is a really deep question, so it's going to take me a little while to answer it. I'm going to have to answer it in parts. So I'm gonna kind of work backwards a little bit on your question. The first part is, are agent to agent and MCP things already solving the problem? And the answer is yes, with conditions, and those conditions are that it's completely balkanized right now. And what I mean by that is that we have various ecosystems, very fragmented and unable to really like access the resources they really need because they are incentivized right now to keep it within their own networks, right? And they're all experimental. I mean, there's not a lot of economic multi-million-dollar trading happening around this activity. And so I think we can break this down now into, like, with that as the preface, like these three areas you're talking about. The first one I'm just going to talk about is the shared state management. And really, I'm going to kind of very briefly just mention that right now L1s are still way too expensive to handle this kind of economic activity. We're completely relying on the L2s. And the issue with the L2s is that they only offer, in the current versions, purely deterministic proofs. And by deterministic proofs, all I'm saying is that we rely on pure math, which means that the problems that they can attest to have to be pure math too. And a lot of generative AI and a lot of things that are happening in the agent space are emergent, are things that involve randomness, especially like LLM or stable diffusion output. And those proofs don't work very well for zero knowledge. In fact, there is no zero knowledge proof circuit for a like an SDXL stable diffusion image. So, knowing that's number one, we had we've done a lot of primary research in how to deal with what we call the non-deterministic proof space. Like, hey, I'm a human. I can look at a piece of art and say it's a cat or a dog, or I can say whether I like it or whether it's good. AI agents should have that capability. They don't right now. I'm very interested in providing that from a computational framework. That actually is kind of one of the pillars that we built our company on. And it kind of leads into this, well, what's everyone doing right now? And that's solving payment rails. I agree with the previous speakers that payment rails are one of the biggest problems right now in this space, especially for coordination between what will hopefully be edge devices and eventual, like, fully decentralizing compute, not just for, graphics, but also for AI. And what we're seeing right now are the X402 payment systems from Coinbase. And this is brilliant because it's essentially, I want to pay an API, and I could just send it a stable coin. And that's great. Why is this important? Because as a service provider, for instance, me with our Delula consumer website, where you can just create viral videos based on like talking gorillas walking through the forest and doing their vlog, right? Talking about something random with crypto. That has a cost associated with it. If I have to use like Google VO3, say that's 60 cents a second. Well, if they're paying for it in the Coinbase app, using our app in Coinbase, well, great. They just pay it with a stable coin, and the process is so liquid and so fast that I can just pay as I'm rendering. That's great. Not everything is as fast as that, right? That's not always possible. So one thing I'm also seeing is the agent commerce protocol from Virtuals. And this system is interesting because what they do is they do a request system where you say, hey, I want this thing. I want this agent to go find me a good trading strategy. I want it to take my $10 and turn it into 20. I want it to draw a picture or make a video with like the Hollywood agent. And you pay once the product is delivered. And the problem with that, of course, for the service provider is now you have a delay. Now you have to create payment pools or reserves so that you can afford the compute and to pay the providers as you're doing the compute. And then once the work is good enough, you get paid from the ACP system. But suddenly now you need another coordinator, and that's where like networks like Wire might be very interested. I was talking with them about this and like creating payment pools amongst things like SETI and Render and others, and that way it's more like accounting. That's where you lead into this idea of the airline problem, right? I mean, like for those of you who aren't familiar, the airlines have gone back and forth over the last couple of decades on whether to do full-on accounting for every like time someone has to switch airlines because of a delayed flight, and they have to pay each other for this, right? And in the old days, they had tons of accountants, and then someone figured out, we can just use statistics. And then now they've gone back to recording everything and having giant accounting ledgers. Um, well, that the rapid accounting ledger works really well in a decentralized fashion as long as the fees are low. You know, as long as you can like reduce that friction, that makes sense. And that's kind of like, okay, now we do like a daily settlement or a weekly settlement, more like a really rapid credit card system, right? And so ironically, after I've said all of this stuff, all the payment rails could do once we have it, and I think we're almost there, is it could enable something like a universal job scheduler network where you could just set up your metadata, set up your auction bidding on it, submit the transaction to the network, and then one of the many networks like Render Network could bid on the job and then take the metadata, create the work. We'll provide the proofs, right? And then suddenly that network is providing like this coordination job scheduling value. And instead of everyone having to roll their own, that seems like it would just be a useful network to exist. So those are my thoughts on the general subject. I know they're wide and varied, but I hope that, you know, take it from here's the problems, here's what payment rails are doing right now, here's the open economic activities. How do we make a good job scheduler that everyone in this group could use for all of their various networks?
Nice. No, and I know we're going to we're going to be touching on payments next because that's sort of what we see as a big blocker. But following on the generative AI side of things, Trevor, um, could hybrid models unlock whole new categories of generative apps, AR, VR, now XR, and real-time personal assistance? And what are we seeing out there?
Yeah, of course, yes. It's where we get so excited. You know, if any of you saw Jules' talk at RenderCon, there's a lot of thought on the OTOY side going into how these interfaces will change on the generative side and what hybrid models will bring. And when I say hybrid, it's going to be a combination of centralized compute, of edge and local compute, as well as potentially hybrid in terms of generated versus rendered. You know, when I look at the ultimate end goal, it's exciting 3D experiences. It's ultimately the holodeck, and incrementally getting there through AR and VR experiences is going to need a combination of both. It just can't be done with either at the moment. So we're so excited as we watch these incremental unlocks happen here in almost real time, week to week, that they're going to result in such amazing consumer experiences. It is honestly just the start.
And that was one of the really awesome parts of RenderCon, sort of getting to see some of the technology on real time adoption of video to face and stuff like that. And
Yep.
that was just some cool stuff, especially around the penguin face
Yep.
and Star Trek.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You can see these tools are becoming more and more useful, and yeah, that penguin face replacement is exactly a hybrid model. Yeah, so many more of these to come as the um, infrastructure really unlocks them.
Nice. And now we're going to sort of roll into what seems to be on everyone's mind: payment rails. Um, One of the things that I'm going to be generally putting out there before I hit some people up on questions is we had like today major announcements of Chase Bank partnering with Coinbase, and integrating directly into Coinbase. The thought process I'm having here is how long till we see integrations with X402 for agents to either have direct access through the Coinbase wallet, for personal accounts into the banking industry or their own accounts to pay for compute. And so teams are rethinking whether they need their own infrastructure to rent or lease compute. So Ed, for you, startups building generative AI apps, where does it make sense to use decentralized compute versus GPU, APIs, or even owning it themselves on these payment side?
Wow. So great question and loaded. And I have to admit, I'm still reflecting on some of the comments that Tim Cotton made earlier. Um, when you look at it right now, if I had been, launching, a startup, pre, 2005, 2007, you would have seen a bunch of servers under my desk, and in the garage, and we were literally running all the hardware, out of the house where we were launching the startup. Pretty much since whatever 2010, 2012 on, we've been launching on AWS, Azure, GCP. So the need to own the compute is relative. If you can stand up, if you have a implementation, for example, in financial services or healthcare, where you have to have absolute privacy and absolute control, what you would do today is jump onto a private cloud stack. And so, for example, when I worked in Wall Street, we ran all our infrastructure out of Equinix, Savvis, and other colos. Is basically what we did. So I think Mikey nailed it. In the need to own the hardware, the need to own the compute really depends on the sensitivity and the confidentiality of the information. What we've discovered is we can solve this on by deploying Jumper specifically across AWS, Manifest, and Render. So we're shameless. We'll leverage compute for, it's got to be fit for purpose first and foremost. So it has to meet the computing needs. So if it's online, highly confidential, secure data that we're running, we're going to stand that up on a private instance. But if it's AI rendering, so for example, we ingest a lot of laws and regs, and then we turn those laws and regs into machine readable rules, and then similar to what Tim described, we create deterministic algorithms to ensure the laws and regs are being properly implemented. Well, there's nothing confidential about those laws and regs. So we're totally fine running that compute on Render, and we'll distribute and run that compute on Render all day long. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, Taco, but I would say each team needs to really look at their own implementation, their own requirements, and then implement accordingly. Now I'm going to shamelessly jump over to what Tim was talking about. And when I look at payments, number one, I think you nailed it, Tim. The payment rails are the main blocker for agent autonomy right now. And what we're feverishly focused on is providing autonomous agents with the ability to earn, spend, and settle payments independently, right? But as we all know, today's payment rails are built for humans and corporations. They're not built for robots or smart contracts, right? So all the manual stuff around settlements, reversals, disputes, none of that works. So X402 from Coinbase, it's incredibly pioneering. Like I love it, and I love that you can leverage the API off of the HTTP 402 code. But the challenge is and you even brought it up, Taco. Even though you've got collaborations like JP Morgan Bank collaborating with Coinbase, the open APIs for direct wallet funding and real-time settlement aren't there yet. And so Tim mentioned payment pools, which are used in many industries. They're used in the airline industry. They're used in the telecommunications industry, oil and gas. And the goal of the payment pool is to enable multiple parties to pool payments and automate multi-party settlement, and track usage efficiently and resolve disputes. And they work incredibly well. So if we can get a smart contract and a gateway in place that effectively creates a compute or inference resource payment pool that the agents can query, and then like Tim described, that networks like Manifest and Render can post supply. So you basically get a bid-ask spread where agents are asking for compute and networks are bidding on compute. Then suddenly we can now evolve into the convergence of true programmable agent payments, pooled resource allocation, automated settlement, and real-time market scheduling. And that's going to unlock the independence for AI agents. And I can go on and on, but I'll stop there because I'm sure someone else wants to talk.
No, he covered a lot.
100%.
What, Tim?
I'm sorry, just 100%, dude.
Yeah, no. And so, Paul, this one's for you. What pricing innovations could emerge? And is it a, spot pricing, on demand, subscription? And how does that interlay with on-chain transactions?
Yeah, no, I think we're set for a lot of innovation in this, and I would add just some of the ones you mentioned: spot, subscription, etc. Like the batch processing and the ability for agents to determine what sort of compute they should go after based on the cost of something that they're looking at doing. And so for example, if an agent's reasoning through searching for your flight for tomorrow, if it has 6 hours to try to figure out which flight it should book for you, it doesn't necessarily have to use very expensive compute that may be happening right now. Maybe it can wait an hour and look for like cheaper compute to do that task under. And as we see, some of the models that Trevor was mentioning that use a lot of test time compute, we see the opportunity for a lot of the reasoning cost to be managed and be managed automatically as part of the reasoning of the agent of the model. And so I think this is very exciting. When you intersect that with the payment systems that everyone's been talking about today, so that the agent can manage that payment, they start managing the payment for their own compute, and all agentically. Very, very exciting stuff that can only be done in a distributed way, can only be done with all the ecosystem and infrastructure that we've been talking about, and presents like radically new, exciting opportunities that just keep us moving here at Render Labs, because it's so much fun to play with and think about these opportunities.
The add to that, you sort of bring to my mind, as we were just talking about job bidding through agents. There's even agents that could then bid for energy in a way, and providers could find an economic model for that. So that could become a pricing structure as infrastructure grows to meet that demand.
Oh, totally, very cool. Yeah.
Eric, are we approaching a cloud cost crisis for AI? And how are teams optimizing today? Model distillation, like Paul said, batching or speculative decoding?
It depends on the team and your level of access. So I'm going to get maybe a little far afield on this answer, because something's kind of popped into my head here when you asked that question. We have been in, for many teams, a cloud cost crisis since cloud was created. It depends on who the team is and what their level of funding and access is. Lots and lots and lots of startups in Web 2, and Web 3 is no exception to this, have gone out of business, or nearly so, based on their scaling their cloud costs. It just becomes untenable at some point. And then they lack the skills to move. These are somewhat capture models. These are artificial constraints placed on the clouds, placed by the clouds on the startups. This is similar, actually, to the artificial GPU constraints. So we talk a lot about NVIDIA, and I'm going to throw a grenade here that maybe some people aren't happy with, but I'll throw it anyway. There is no shortage of GPUs. There is no shortage of NVIDIA chips, and there never was. There is a unequal distribution of access to NVIDIA chips, right? And that is enforced by NVIDIA. That is enforced by the distribution and sales model to keep prices high and utilization within a band that they find the most profitable. So my answer to this is yes, there's been a crisis for a very long time, depending on who you are. That crisis will continue and unabated until decentralized models for compute get mature enough so that the majority of workloads, the majority of use cases can be done decentralized. And there's an effect here that I want to point out that I'm not sure that if you're outside this industry and you're not super focused on infrastructure, you won't even realize is occurring. So there's the primary impact of, hey, I can move my workloads decentralized. Decentralized is cheaper because of a lot of reasons. And the tooling is getting better and better and better. And so I'm going to move some of my workloads. Great. That saves me some money. That reduces my cloud cost crisis a little bit. And again, you mentioned a lot of the techniques. We could do a whole talk just on all these techniques of segmenting and batching and how everything works from an ML ops standpoint. But let's put that aside for a minute. The primary thing you need to induce is economic competition. And that is what the big clouds have essentially price fixed their way out of, is they're really not competing in the way that you think that they are. Behind the scenes, everyone is based on the AWS price table. That is the global standard. Every cloud provider that is at any scale is a derivative of price table for their market. So you think there's competition, there's actually not that much competition. NVIDIA has made sure that the way their distribution model works, there's no competition in how you get NVIDIA chips, right? So you get picked or you don't, and oftentimes NVIDIA will come to you as an investor or with some sort of leverage and get you up or in some cases push you down that distribution chain, effectively killing you. So the first thing we need to do is incite competition through Web3, through getting all the GPUs we can on the network with access through tooling to pull that primary lever. But there's a secondary lever that is hidden in the matrix that you don't see, which is once that occurs, that breaks some of the distribution strategy that the big clouds and NVIDIA have for their compute resources. Once you start breaking that distribution strategy, they have to compete, and they will, which means they'll alter that distribution strategy. That second order effect is really what we want to start seeing. Once we see that in the Web3 world, we know that we're on the path to winning, because we know, if you can think about it, as I'm not trying to set it up as oppositional, by the way. I'm fine with Google. I'm fine with AWS. I'm fine with centralized compute. In fact, at Manifest, our model is to actually integrate that and just more properly own it and control it and use it. So I'm not trying to make an argument against centralized compute here. What I'm making on again is against is the economic distribution model, which once we see that crack, we know we're on a path to success and very rapid growth in Web3, because that's when NVIDIA is feeling it. I'll stop there, but I could literally talk for a day about this. Don't even get me started on alternate GPU and APU and all these other TPU platforms that should be much more used than they are. And again, that all comes down to NVIDIA's sales and distribution strategy. Once that starts to crack, you'll also see 10 new technologies that, again, we're partnered with already at Manifest, that as soon as they're viable, will give you not only options that you could never get before for NVIDIA compute, will give you options for the next 5 technologies that you should be using, instead of going with NVIDIA GPUs, right? And that opens up a whole new world of powerful compute for AI. So I'll stop there. I hope that partially answered the question.
No, it did. And
So actually, Taco, before you jump on, so Eric, what I would add to that is we have a market equilibrium now, and you called it out perfectly around the AWS pricing table and how NVIDIA is driving its distribution and controlling the distribution. So with that, I think the new market opportunity that's showing up, and you described it perfectly, is a shift from the existing oligopoly to open markets. And what makes the markets open is having the resources on a decentralized network where you can post the bid-ask spread. So the networks can post their supply and their availability. And someone mentioned the Texas electric market. When you look in Texas, the price of energy is at that moment in time, and it is highly volatile. It's not like the AWS pricing tables where it's locked in, like you would get, in a municipally controlled, electrical generation. So with that, I think what you set up perfectly there, Eric, is once we can flip that equilibrium, the incumbents are going to have to adopt or lose ground, and what's required is that shift.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll make one further note that maybe is kind of an insider, maybe a more salacious detail here as well. At Manifest, we created something called Project Bedrock, which is fundamental to our distribution strategy, where the network has tokenized actual facilities and power plants at those facilities, and then manipulates the price per kilowatt hour of the power going into those. That all exists at our L0 right now. So when you're using any of our tech, in a lot of cases, you're actually routed to a center where all of the power optimization that goes into the cost that you pay on the tokenomics side is already optimized for you. So, for example, at those sites, we can usually leverage local power plants at a third of the cost of grid, even for stable baseload power, right? So energy is key. And we've definitely, with Project Bedrock, spent a lot of time working on the energy problem. And with partners like yourself at Gember, we're working on the payment rails problem. And then we're also working on, getting the actual compute, which is really a network hardware problem, onto the network, as you mentioned, because the compute has to be available, right, to do the bid ask spread. So yes, all absolutely correct. But I really wanted to get that detail out of, yeah, we're working on the power as well. And there's some amazing opportunities to drive down costs there as well.
Amazing. Yeah. No, thank you. We're closing in on time. We had a bunch of other questions to go through, but really got to deep dive on a lot of these key topics, which was really exciting. And I want to thank, on behalf of Render and Manifest, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to thank all of these amazing panelists. But to close this out, sort of want to go into a quick lightning round. And I'll go down. I'll call you out as we go through before you have to go. But what's one bold prediction or key insight that you'd leave our audience with about generative AI and who's paying the compute bill? Mikey, I want to start with you.
Yeah, Render, I think, is our big brother. When you look at Render and when you look at the application layer that Otoy represents and the consumer layer that their customers represent, that is the pattern that I think is going to allow the market to bring all of this to fruition. Because what they actually have is they have a product that people want and they pay for. By having a product people want and they pay for, it aligns engineering teams behind what those people need and allows for fast progress. And I think right now, what we're seeing start to come to play is the 18-month-old decentralized AI industry is understanding this and starting to build those layers. And so just want to shout out like a group that makes sense to this one within the Think ecosystem, the Supermodels team. So Supermodels team is generative AI artists and traditional artists that are building a LoRa training system to turn your art style into your agent that you own and can run. When we get more and more of these application layers that are bringing actual paid users in, I believe that's the thing that's going to unlock this whole thing. And I'm just excited to be doing it with all these great people. So thanks for having me.
Okay. And then next up, Paul, if you're still here. Nope. Tim?
I mean, I have a bold prediction, but I'm going to just frame it as a question to the group. Would everyone here, because we're all essentially friends, we all have networks that are cooperative and stuff that is interesting for each other to like add value to each other, would you all be interested in helping design this universal job network? Because Scripted's network, that's what our intention really is for coordinating all these AI resources, right? Because we don't want to be the ones providing the GPU or solving the energy problems or um, like finding all of it. We just want to create a marketplace for AI. And I honestly think like in the framing of this conversation, I personally have discovered a way to communicate the value of what we're doing that I didn't have before as a tool. And when I really think about the idea of just being able to provide not the payment rails, but like the auction bidding system where like agents could just be hooked up to render, be hooked up to think, where like all of our like and use manifest, where all of these networks could play nicely, almost like in the Google SEM auction way. It seems like a really powerful paradigm, and I'd be curious to see if anyone would like to help me solve some of the gap problems because there's a lot of like use case issues that I can't just discover ourselves at Scripted.
Sign me
Yeah.
up. I'm there.
Yeah, absolutely. On behalf of Manifest, absolutely. We love partnering rather than building by ourselves. So absolutely anyone on this call who wants to partner, just reach out to Taco and yeah, we'll be glad to partner on any of this.
Nice. Ed, bold prediction.
So I've got several, and I'm going to frame them, which is that the generative AI compute market it is being reshaped. I was going to say is going to, but it is being reshaped by automation, open competition, and transparency. And we have to drive both the technological and economic innovation. And so the networks and the marketplaces that empower both machines and humans to pay, bid, and choose their services is what's going to break this oligopoly that Eric was talking about. So, in that context, I've got a few big predictions. My first one is number one, autonomous agents are going to be both consumers and payers. So, within the next 2 to 3 years, the majority of generative AI workflows, especially automated tasks, are going to be paid for directly by AI agents, and that's going to be programmatically managed. And we're building for that future. The second one is compute markets are going to transition to real-time open bidding models. And Tim alluded to the way that Google with DoubleClick and the other tools enabled the open bidding on advertising. So my assertion is the prevailing pricing table models set by hyperscalers is going to be fragmented. And instead, we're going to move to a real-time bid-ask marketplace for compute. And that's going to be powered by decentralized networks and transparent ledgers. And if a tool like Scripted helps to orchestrate that, well, then heck, I'm all ears. I would love to learn more about that. The other one, and I got to give Eric credit because he inspired this one on the moment, is we're going to see the end of manufactured scarcity and cloud oligopoly. So decentralized compute networks, and as Eric described, by aggregating GPUs and CPUs from data centers, individuals, all the things that Render is doing, is going to break the existing hardware distribution and pricing bottlenecks. It's going to erode NVIDIA's gatekeeper role, and it's going to give us greater access. Given that I came from call it Web 2, traditional banking and payments and telco, the thing that I'm seeing is Web 2 enterprises are shifting to hybrid and decentralized compute for cost control. Render's seeing this with the studios and the others in Hollywood that are starting to take on and leveraging the decentralized tools and infrastructure. We're seeing the bills for private cloud run away. We're seeing complaints about vendor lock-in, and we're seeing the hybrid strategies get adopted. So this is happening. Like this is right freaking now. And then as a result of all of that, we're going to see new business models. And the business models are going to be based on microtransactions and outcome-based pricing, and that's how they're going to dominate. So I'm so excited to be in this space and would welcome any and all collaboration to make this reality.
Nice. Thank you. No, and I love the calls to actions for partnerships. Eric, to you to lightning question, key insight that you'd like to leave our audience with.
Well, there's lots of interesting stuff. I think one of the key insights may be that that you're going to see an order of magnitude shift in the abilities of AI based on the order of magnitude shift in the underlying availability of compute as we break these models with the decentralized ecosystems that we're talking about. If you look at the top of the stack and the emergent behaviors that come from, say, offering a price that's 10% of the techalopoly price, whatever you want to call it. Ed had a better word than I did. Then that unleashes orders of magnitude improvements at the top of the stack. So I'm really happy to be working on boring stuff in infrastructure because I know every time I deliver a GPU or a CPU that a startup couldn't get from AWS or couldn't get at the price they need, I'm unleashing an order of magnitude effect at the top of the stack. So I think if I was to provide a key insight, it would be that. It would be small revolutions at the bottom of the stack equal very large revolutions at the top of the stack, especially when accelerated by AI. And I'm excited to see what all of you working at the top of the stack who might be listening to this are going to do when we make these, changes in power or changes in how NVIDIA chips are accessed, or bringing a whole new class of say, TPU online or something like that. I'm excited to see what's going to happen at the top of the stack because that's an order of magnitude shift. So leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And to round this out, Trevor.
I wanted, yeah, love it, Tucker. This is amazing, by the way. I love getting together this group every time. So I want to take it to a demand prediction. I'm really excited at where video to video is going. VO3 is a great first step, but it's centralized and expensive. For me, open source video to video improvements and really a step up in the level of composability and control is the prediction I'm expecting to see in the short term here. And I really think it unlocks so much on a decentralized basis that we could really see an amazing usage of our resources and our partners' resources.
Nice, thank you. And talking about resources, I just want to, shout out to my co-host Sunny, and I want to thank Render and Manifest, their teams working in the back to make this space happen. If you've learned anything from this space or something's been triggered as a builder in you, please reach out to any and all of these speakers today. Sunny, man, it just gets better and better every week, it seems like.
You know what? I love it. I think Trevor hit the nail on the head. This is such a great bunch of people we've got here. And I'd love to thank all of our guests for joining us on our third AI specific spaces. There's been some great insights, and overall, it seems like a super optimistic outlook for the future of generative AI, and I'm super excited for that. Obviously, it is super early innings in this space, and the next 6 months are going to look so different from today, let alone 12 months or 5 years, right? This is like a decades long effort, but all of these decentralized paradigms are kind of like a speck of dust in the large scheme of things. I think someone else mentioned something similar to that earlier, but I think patience is key because things may seem like they move slowly, but then all of a sudden, boom, we've got everything we've been asking for. It's amazing to see. Um, yeah, excellent spaces. Thank you so much for co-hosting this, Taco.
No, definitely, Sonny. And Sonny, I feel remiss not asking you any hardball questions as we've sort of gone through this. So I have to ask you, Star Wars or Star Trek?
Ooh, I love that question. Star Wars or Star Trek? So I've recently been watching a lot of